I worked so hard for this degree.
We agreed you would take care of the home.
But I want to save lives.
My decision is final. Amina, I want you to resign. Be a full-time wife. This is my vision for us.
But I am a doctor.
My son-in-law refused to let my daughter work after the wedding, despite her medical degree. My daughter spent 7 years becoming a doctor. 7 years of nights without sleep, of exams that broke grown men, of a body so thin from studying that I used to sit outside her hostel gate in Zaria just to watch her eat one proper meal before I traveled back to Kaduna. And on the 4th month of her marriage, her husband stood in my parlor, in my own house, and told me that Amina would not be needing her white coat again. Before you keep watching, let me just say, if stories like this hold you, stay till the end, because what I found out about that man's family was not what any of us expected, and I promise you, by the time I finish, you will understand why I nearly lost my daughter to a silence I did not see coming. My name is Halima. I am telling you this the way it happened, not the way it looked from outside, because from outside, everybody said Amina married well. The women at the mosque said it, the neighbors said it, even my own sisters, who are not easily impressed by anybody's son-in-law, said it, more than once, in that particular tone women use when they are genuinely quietly relieved that a daughter has landed somewhere safe. Let me tell you what marrying well actually cost her, because the version that circulated at parties and family gatherings was not the version that was unfolding night after night behind that compound's gate. Amina was my second child, my only daughter, born between 2 boys who never once tried as hard as she did for anything in their lives. From the time she was small, she had this way of deciding a thing and then simply doing it. No noise, no announcement, just quiet determination that unsettled people who expected girls to ask permission before they wanted things. When she said she would study medicine, her father laughed, not unkindly, just the laugh of a man who did not yet know his daughter. By the time she finished secondary school with the best result in her set, nobody in that house was laughing anymore. We are Fulani people, originally from Sokoto, before my husband's work brought us to Kaduna, and in our family, education was never the argument. My husband, Sule, believed a woman with a degree brought honor to a household, not shame. It was the marrying of her that became complicated because the man who wanted her, Aliu, came from a family that believed something different, and none of us knew it until it was too late to simply walk away. Aliu first came into our lives through Amina's cousin Zainab, who worked at the same logistics company and had, in her own words, been matching the two of them in her head for months before she ever said a word to either of them. He came to our house properly, the way a serious man comes to a house, with his uncle and a family friend as witnesses, and sat stiffly on the edge of our good sofa, answering my husband's questions with the careful precision of a man who had rehearsed for this exact interrogation. Sule asked him the questions every Fulani father asks. What do you do? Where is your family from? What do you intend for this girl's future? And Aliu, without missing a beat, said, a wife who saves lives brings honor to my house, not shame. I would never ask her to put that down. I remember exhaling that evening in a way I did not realize I had been holding my breath until it left me. We believed him. There was nothing in his manner, his eyes, his tone that suggested performance. He asked Amina thoughtful questions about her work during their courtship phone calls. She told me this herself, remembered the names of her difficult cases, asked how a particular patient she had mentioned weeks earlier was recovering. This was not a man performing tolerance for an audience of in-laws, or if it was a performance so convincing that even Amina, sharp as she is, did not see the seams in it. I tell you all of this because I want you to understand that what came later did not arrive because we were careless in vetting him. It arrived because some things do not reveal themselves until circumstance forces them out of hiding, and no amount of careful questioning before a wedding can fully predict what a person becomes once real pressure finds them. I met Aliu's mother, Hajia Rakia, 3 times before the wedding, and each time she was warm in the particular way that older women are warm when they have already decided something about you and are simply waiting for the right moment to reveal it. She would hold my hand a little too long, praise Amina's beauty a little too much, and say almost nothing about Amina's profession. Not once, not even in passing, not even when I mentioned it myself to see what she would say. I remember thinking at the time that perhaps she simply did not care for such details, the way some women of her generation did not care to discuss careers, preferring to speak of children and homes and respect. I did not read it as a warning. I want you to understand that. I am not a foolish woman, but even careful women miss things when they are looking at the wrong part of the picture. Aliyu himself was polite, well-spoken, worked in an oil and gas logistics company in Kaduna, drove a decent car, prayed on time, and never once in the entire courtship told my daughter that her medicine would become a problem. Not once. I want that on record before I tell you what he did 4 months into the marriage, because this was not a man who announced his intentions and married her anyway with her eyes open. This was something else. This was a man who did not know his house was going to demand this of him until his house demanded it.
The wedding was in December, and it was beautiful. The kind of wedding people still discuss in Kaduna when they run into me at events. A large, colorful, properly done Fulani wedding, with drumming that lasted till morning, and enough rice to feed half the street. Amina wore white, and then changed into her mother's own wedding wrapper for the traditional segment, the same wrapper I wore in 1989. And when she walked out in it, I cried the kind of tears you cry when you cannot separate joy from fear, because a mother always feels both on her daughter's wedding day, whether she admits it or not. She moved into Aliyu's family compound in the GRA area, a large house that Aliyu's late father had built before he passed, a house that still had his portrait hanging in the main parlor, stern-faced in an oversized frame, watching everyone who entered. Hadia lived in the boys' quarters at the back with her younger son, Aliyu's brother, Nasiru, who was still finishing his own studies. It was not unusual for a Fulani bride to move into her husband's family compound. What was unusual was what began happening inside it. For the first month, nothing seemed wrong. Amina was posted at the teaching hospital, doing her housemanship, long shifts, night calls, the exhausting rhythm every young doctor knows. And Aliyu seemed proud, even boastful about it to his colleagues, the way new husbands sometimes are, showing off a wife who could save lives. She would call me, tired but happy, telling me about a delivery she had assisted, a diagnosis she had caught that a senior colleague had missed, the small victories that made all those years of studying worth something. Then, somewhere in the second month, the calls started changing. She began mentioning, almost as an aside, that Aliyu had asked why she needed to take night calls when she was a married woman now, that his mother had asked at dinner in front of everyone whether a wife's place at midnight was in a hospital ward or in her husband's bed. Small comments, the kind of comments a daughter makes to her mother almost as a joke, testing the air, seeing if her mother will laugh it off or take it seriously. I did not laugh it off. I asked her directly, is this becoming a pattern? And she told me, no, Mama, don't worry, it's just his mother. You know how our mothers are. I let it go. I should not have let it go, but I want you to understand something about the way these things creep into a marriage. They never arrive as a declaration. They arrive as small comments you are meant to laugh off, until one day they are not comments anymore, they are conditions. There was a particular evening in the second month, Amina told me much later, that she now recognizes as the real beginning, though at the time she brushed past it. She had come home close to 11 after an emergency cesarean section that had gone longer than expected, still in her scrubs, exhausted in the specific way that a young doctor after a difficult delivery is exhausted. And she had found the food cold on the table, uncovered, and Aliyu already asleep with his back turned toward her side of the bed. When she woke him gently to explain, he had not shouted, had not accused her of anything directly. He had simply said, in a flat voice she did not recognize, every night this week it has been something. It was not even true. It had been 2 nights that week, not every night. But she remembers not correcting him because correcting him felt in that moment like it would cost more than it was worth. That is often how these things begin, I have come to understand. Not with an argument you can point to and say, there, that was the moment, but with a small exaggeration you let pass because you are too tired to fight it. And then another, and then a pattern forms out of accumulated silences rather than accumulated proof. By the 3rd month, Amina had stopped taking extra night calls, not because Aliyu had forbidden it outright, but because every time she came home late, there would be a coldness in the house, a silence at dinner table, Hajia's pointed remarks about hospital wives who forget they have husbands. She began scheduling her shift around keeping the peace at home, something no serious doctor can sustainably do, and her supervising consultant, a woman named Dr. Ihuoma, actually called me directly. She had gotten my number from Amina's file during an emergency contact update to ask gently, professionally, whether everything was all right at home, because Amina's performance had begun to slip in a way that worried her. Dr. Ihuoma was careful on that call, the way a good senior colleague is careful when raising a delicate matter, choosing her words as though she were handling something fragile. She told me that Amina, who until recently had been one of the sharpest housemen in her unit, had begun requesting shift swaps with unusual frequency, had twice asked to leave in ward round early with vague explanations, and had, during a difficult but entirely manageable delivery the previous week, seemed distracted in a way that was simply not like her, distracted enough that a senior nurse had quietly flagged it to her. She said, I am not accusing anyone of anything, and I am not asking you to tell me your family's business. I am only telling you, mother to mother, that something is pulling your daughter's attention away from work she used to love completely, and I thought you should know before it costs her something she cannot easily get back. That phone call frightened me more than anything Amina herself had told me, because it meant the trouble had left our family conversations and entered her professional life, where people who did not love her were now noticing, and I understood, sitting with the phone still warm in my hand after the call ended, that whatever this was, it had already grown large enough to threaten the very thing it was disguised as protecting. Before I continue, let me pause here, because I know some of you are already forming opinions about Aliyu, and I want to be fair to how this actually unfolded, because it is more complicated than a man simply deciding to control his wife. If this kind of story means something to you, if you have your own version of a family testing what a woman is allowed to keep of herself after marriage, stay with me till the end and consider joining the family here on the channel, because I promise you, what I uncovered about that household changed how I saw my own son-in-law entirely, and it is not the story you are expecting. The 4th month is when it broke into the open. Amina called me on a Thursday evening, and I could hear immediately from her voice that particular flatness that comes from when a person has been crying for so long they have run out of the energy to cry properly, that something had happened. She told me Aliyu had come home from work, sat her down in their room, and told her, calmly, as though he had rehearsed it, that he thought it was time she resigned from the hospital. Not paused her career, not reduced her hours, resigned. He said a man could not build a home with a wife who was never in it, that his mother had raised him with a father who worked and a mother who was fully present, and that this was the kind of home he wanted for his own children when they came. He told her medicine had been a wonderful achievement, something to be proud of, something their children could be told about one day, but that it could not continue now that she was a wife. I did not sleep that night. I lay beside my husband Sule and I told him everything, and I watched a man who rarely raised his voice sit up in bed at almost midnight and say quietly, that is not the man who came to ask for her hand. He was right. This was the strange part. This was not consistent with the man who had sat across us during the courtship, who, when my husband raised the question directly, because Sule is not a man who leaves such things to assumption, had told us that he respected Amina's profession and had no intention of abandoning it. We had it essentially as a spoken understanding, if not a written one. Something had shifted between that conversation and this one, and I needed to know what.
I decided to visit. Not to fight, not yet, but to see with my own eyes what was happening inside that house. Because a mother can sense from a phone call that something is wrong, but she cannot always see the shape of it until she is standing in the room. I told Amina I wanted to come the following weekend, ostensibly to bring some foodstuff, the kind of visit no new husband refuses his mother-in-law. When I arrived, Hajia received me with the same too long handhold, the same warm performance, but this time I was watching for what lay underneath it. And I noticed something I had missed before, how her eyes moved to the portrait of her late husband on the wall almost every time the topic of Amina's work came up in conversation, as though she were checking with him or drawing some instruction from him. I noticed how Aliyu, in his own mother's presence, seemed to shrink slightly, answering questions the way a boy answers a teacher, rather than the way a grown man discusses his marriage. And I noticed on a side table in the parlor, half tucked beneath a stack of newspapers, an old photograph cracked at one corner of a much younger Hajia in a nurse's uniform standing outside what looked like a hospital ward, her face unsmiling in a way that struck me as strange for what should have been a proud professional photograph. There was something else that visit that I did not immediately understand the weight of. While Hajia was in the kitchen supervising the food, I stepped briefly into the main parlor to admire, as I had been invited to, some new upholstery she had recently had done on the old sofas. An odd, almost defensive kind of home improvement, I thought even then, for a household that would soon show signs of financial strain, though I did not connect the two at the time. On the side table nearest the late husband's portrait sat a small dish of naira notes and coins, the kind every Nigerian household keeps for small errands and okada fares. And beside it, half hidden under a folded newspaper, a courier envelope addressed to Aliyu from a cooperative society whose name I did not recognize, its seal already broken. I did not open it. I am not the kind of woman who opens another person's post, even in suspicion. But I noted the name printed on its corner, Amana Farmers and Traders Cooperative Society, and something about the formality of the letterhead, the officiality of it sitting so carelessly abandoned on a side table in a parlor otherwise arranged with such visible pride, snagged at the edge of my mind, the way a loose thread snags on a rough surface. I said nothing about it that day, not even to Amina. I simply held on to the name the way you hold on to a name you are not yet sure you will need. I did not ask about the photograph that day either. I filed both details away, the way you file away things that do not fit, trusting that they would matter later. What I did do was speak to Amina alone in the kitchen, under the excuse of helping her prepare food, and there she told me something that had not made it into our phone calls, that Aliyu had begun, gently but consistently, asking to see her salary alert whenever it came in, and that 2 weeks earlier, without telling her beforehand, he had gone to the bank and added his name as a joint signatory to what had been her personal account. When she asked him why, he told her it was simply what husbands and wives did, that separateness in marriage was what Western television had poisoned young people's minds with, that everything should be theirs now, not hers and his. On its own, this could be read as ordinary, even reasonable in a culture where shared finances are common. But paired with the sudden demand that she stop earning that money altogether, it took on a different shape. A man does not usually fight this hard to gain access to an account he is also fighting this hard to empty. Amina also told me, almost as an afterthought, stirring the stew a little too vigorously as she said it, that Aliyu's phone had begun ringing at odd hours with calls he stepped outside to answer, always with the same excuse: work matters. Even though she had noticed he no longer wore the branded polo shirt his old company issued for client visits, had not mentioned a single colleague's name in weeks, and once, when she asked casually how the Lagos contract he used to talk about was progressing, had given her an answer so vague and generalized that it barely qualified as an answer at all. She said she had noticed these things the way you notice a picture slightly crooked on a wall, aware something is off without stopping to ask why. Because a new wife who wants her marriage to work often trains herself without meaning to look past small inconsistencies rather than interrogate them one by one. I remember holding her hand across that kitchen counter and telling her, "You are allowed to ask why. A wife who cannot ask why is not a wife. She is a guest in her own home." She laughed, a small, tired laugh, and said, "Mama, it's not that simple with Aliyu's family. Everything here moves through his mother first." That sentence, more than anything else that day, told me exactly where I needed to look next. That was the first real thread. I held on to it and said nothing yet, because accusing a son-in-law without proof does more damage than good, and because I am a woman who has learned over 51 years of life that the first explanation is rarely the whole explanation. If this kind of unraveling interests you, the way a marriage problem that looks simple on the surface always has roots running somewhere older, somewhere you didn't expect to look, then this channel is exactly the kind of place you should be subscribed to, because we are only at the middle of what I found, and what came next reshaped everything I thought I understood about that family. I went home and I did something I am not proud of, but which I do not regret. My younger brother Ibrahim works in banking compliance, and I asked him, quietly, to make some informal inquiries. Nothing illegal, simply the kind of asking around that people with contacts in Kaduna's tight business circles can do without anyone knowing they are doing it. I gave him 3 things: the name of Aliu's employer, the cooperative society name I had memorized from that envelope, and a request to find out discreetly whether Aliu's name appeared anywhere in recent property or loan filings tied to the GRA compound. Ibrahim, who has always had a soft spot for Amina since she was the niece who used to correct his English homework as a child, did not ask too many questions about why I needed this information. He simply said, "Give me some days," in the tone of a man who understood that a mother does not ask for this kind of information unless she already suspects the answer will not be good.
Those days felt unusually long. I busied myself with ordinary things: market, prayers, a cousin's naming ceremony I attended without absorbing a single word said there, while turning the situation over and over, trying to prepare myself for whatever Ibrahim would bring back. I told myself I was preparing for the worst, so that I would not be ambushed by it. But the truth is that nothing fully prepares a mother for confirming that the man her daughter married has been living a double life inside his own home for months. What came back within a week disturbed me more than I expected. Aliu's logistics company, the one he was supposedly thriving in, had in fact let him go 8 months earlier, 4 months before the wedding, after a client contract fell through and the company downsized. He had been telling everyone, including my own daughter, that he was still employed there, leaving the house every morning at the usual time, returning at the usual time, maintaining the entire architecture of a working man's day, while in truth he had been unemployed since before he even proposed marriage. Worse, my brother discovered that Aliu had taken a significant loan from a cooperative society roughly 6 months prior, using the family compound, the same house his late father had built, the house he did not solely own, since it legally belonged jointly to him and his mother and his younger brother, as informal collateral through a private arrangement that Hajia may or may not have fully understood the risk of. The loan had gone into a business venture, some import scheme involving spare vehicle parts that had collapsed within 3 months, leaving Aliu with debt, no job, and a family compound now quietly at risk. Ibrahim sat with me in my own kitchen the evening he brought this information, laying it out carefully, document by document, the way a careful man lays out something he knows will hurt his sister. He had gotten the termination confirmation through a former schoolmate, now working in the logistics company's HR department, who had pulled the file discreetly off the books as a personal favor rather than anything official. The cooperative loan trail had been harder, requiring a second contact, a clerk Ibrahim knew from his own compliance circles who owed him a favor from years back. And even then, Ibrahim admitted, some of what he found was inference rather than hard documentation. The compound's informal use as collateral was described to him verbally by someone close to the transaction, not confirmed on paper, since such arrangements are often handled through community trust rather than formal mortgage instruments in that part of town. Still, taken together, the picture was unmistakable enough that I did not doubt it, and Ibrahim, closing his notebook that evening, said only, "Halima, whatever you decide to do with this, do it carefully. A man hiding a wound this size is not thinking clearly, and cornered men do not always respond the way you expect them to." I sat with this information for 2 days before I told my husband, And even then, I did not immediately tell Amina because I needed to understand what it meant before I handed my daughter a grenade with the pin already pulled. Here is what it meant once I turned it over enough times. Aliyu was not asking his wife to give up medicine because of some deep philosophical belief about the sanctity of a present wife in the home. Or rather, that belief was real to him, but it was not the whole truth. The whole truth was that a man drowning in debt he was too ashamed to disclose to his new bride needed control over every income entering that household. And their wife earning her own money, moving in her own professional circles, developing her own independence, was a threat to a fragile, collapsing arrangement he was desperately trying to hold together with pride and silence. If Amina resigned, her salary would stop being a separate thing that belonged to her judgment. If she stayed home, she would not be positioned to notice, as quickly as a working professional woman might, exactly how deep the family's financial trouble actually ran. Control over her freedom and control over the money were not two separate demands. They were the same demand wearing different clothes. But even this was not the full picture. And this is the part that genuinely surprised me, the part I want you to sit with because it changed how angry I was allowed to be at a man I had until that point been building toward hating cleanly and simply. I went back to that photograph, the cracked one of Hajia in her nurse's uniform. On my next visit, I finally asked her about it, gently, as one older woman asking another about her youth, no accusation in my voice at all. And Hajia, perhaps because I had earned some trust by then, perhaps because the question simply arrived at a moment she was tired of holding it alone, possibly not even her own sons in full detail. She had trained as a nurse in the early 80s, one of the first women in her extended family to hold a formal profession, at a time when a girl choosing a uniform over a kitchen apron still drew comment from aunties at every family gathering. She told me she loved it in a way she struggled to put into words even 30-odd years later. The particular pride of being useful in a room where a stranger's survival depended on your steady hands. The quiet dignity of walking home in her uniform past neighbors who once doubted her father was right to send her to school at all. She had been good at it, genuinely good, the kind of nurse senior doctors specifically requested for difficult deliveries, the kind of name whose name got passed between worried families as someone to ask for by name at the ward desk. She had married Aliyu's late father, Malam Danladi, a cloth trader with a stall at the central market, against some resistance from his side of the family, who felt a working wife would embarrass a man who wanted to be seen as fully providing for his household without her wife's income supplementing it. He had agreed, reluctantly, initially only for a year or two until the children come, that she could continue nursing after the wedding, much as Aliyu had once agreed with Amina in almost identical language, a coincidence Hajia herself had not seemed to notice until she was telling me the story aloud and heard her own son's promise echoing back at her 30 years earlier. For the first several years, it had worked, imperfectly, but workably, the way most real marriages do, with Danladi's initial reluctance softening as her salary quietly helped stock his stall during 2 lean trading seasons neither of them spoke about openly at the time. Then came a night. She described it to me with her eyes fixed somewhere past my shoulder, the way people describe things they have relived too many times in private, her voice dropping so low at points that I had to lean forward to catch it. She told me she still remembers the exact weight of the silence that fell over that delivery room, a silence she says she has never once in 30 years fully left. It was, by every proper medical account she later obtained, not her fault. The obstetric emergency, a cord complication no bedside intervention alone could have resolved without the surgical capacity that arrived too late, had been beyond what any nurse alone could have managed. And an internal hospital review, conducted months later, eventually cleared her formally of negligence in writing. A letter she said she still kept, folded soft with age, in the bottom of an old tin box. But the family of the deceased infant did not wait for formal reviews. And grief, she told me,
does not care what a hospital committee eventually concludes on paper. They spread the story through the community with the particular cruelty reserved for grieving people looking for someone to blame, embellishing details with each retelling until in the version that eventually circulated furthest, Hajia had supposedly been careless, distracted, even asleep at her post. None of which had happened, but by the time the truth might have caught up with the rumor had already outrun it by months. Within weeks, Hajia's name had become attached, in the mouths of half of Kaduna's traders and their wives, to a dead baby and a nurse who had supposedly been careless. Her husband's business, which relied heavily on the trust of that same trading community for credit and repeat customers, began losing patrons who no longer wanted to deal with that nurse's husband, a phrase Hajia says she overheard directly, twice, from women browsing his stall who did not realize she was within earshot. The shame, real or manufactured, sat inside their home like a fourth occupant. 2 years later, her husband had a stroke, not directly caused by any of it, the doctor said, simply his age and his blood pressure and his habits. But Hajia had never once in all the years since stopped privately believing that the humiliation had eaten at him slowly enough to make his body give up early. He survived the stroke with lasting weakness and died 11 years later, a diminished version of the vigorous trader he had been, and Hajia raised her 2 sons largely alone in the shadow of a story that the whole neighborhood still occasionally, cruelly resurrected. Isn't that the nurse whose case killed a baby, even decades after she had resigned from nursing entirely the year after the stroke and never returned to a hospital ward again in her life? I sat in that parlor with my mouth dry because I understood all at once what I was looking at. Hajia had not simply raised her sons to believe that working wives were dangerous to a household as an abstract cultural principle. She had lived what she believed was proof of it, had buried that proof inside herself for 30 years, and had, without ever necessarily saying it in so many words, planted the seed of that fear directly into the understanding of what marriage required to survive. Aliyu was not simply a controlling man protecting his fragile finances. He was also a son who had grown up watching his mother's grief calcify into doctrine, who had absorbed, the way children absorb the unspoken terror of a parent, the idea that a wife's professional life outside the home was a live wire that could without warning electrocute an entire family stability. When his own finances began collapsing under him, his own quiet, private catastrophe, that old inherited fear did not stay dormant. It surfaced, and it attached itself conveniently and unconsciously to the most immediate, controllable target in his life, his brilliant, independent, newly married wife. This did not excuse him. I want to be very clear about that, because I know some of you watching this will be tempted to feel sympathy so large it swallows accountability, and I do not want that to happen. A grown man is still responsible for the choices he makes with his inherited fears. Aliyu lied to my daughter about his employment for months. He attempted to seize financial control of her account under a manipulative claim about marital unity. He allowed his mother's undealt with grief to become a leash around his wife's neck, rather than doing the harder work of examining it, questioning it, and choosing differently. Understanding where a wound comes from is not the same as excusing the wound it causes someone else. But it did mean that the fight ahead of us was not simply going to be convince a stubborn man to let his wife work. It was going to require pulling an entire family's buried grief into the light. And I did not know, walking into that confrontation, whether the family would survive being exposed like that, or whether my daughter's marriage would survive it either. If you have ever discovered that a problem in your own family was actually rooted in something from a generation before you, something nobody ever properly grieved, you understand exactly how heavy that realization feels. Stay with me, because the confrontation that followed was not the one any of us expected, and it did not end the way either side walked into that room wanting it to end. I asked Amina and Aliyu, along with Hajia, to come to our house the following Sunday, framing it as an ordinary family lunch, though Amina, sharp as she has always been, suspected something more was coming and asked me on the phone the night before. I told her only this: tomorrow you will finally understand why your husband has become someone you don't recognize. Trust me one more day. She trusted me. That trust is something I do not take lightly, even now telling you this story. They arrived Sunday afternoon, Aliyu in a plain kaftan rather than his usual pressed shirt, as though some part of him already sensed that this would not be an ordinary visit and had dressed for humility rather than performance. Hajia wore her good wrapper, the one she reserved for occasions she considered important, and I remember thinking, watching her settle into the chair I offered her, that she had no idea yet how important this particular occasion was actually going to become for her personally. My husband Sule sat at the head of the table, unusually quiet, the way he becomes when he is preparing to say something that matters, his hands folded in front of him, with a stillness that I recognized from years of marriage as his way of holding his temper in check before he trusted himself to speak. I served food first. You cannot begin a hard conversation with hungry people in a Fulani household. Some traditions are simply correct. And besides, I needed the ordinary rhythm of serving and eating to steady my own hands, which had not stopped trembling slightly since that morning. We spoke of small things over the meal: a cousin's upcoming wedding, the price of rice at the market, whether the rains would come early this year, the kind of conversation that exists specifically to postpone the conversation everyone in the room secretly knows is coming. Amina barely touched her food. I watched her eyes move between her husband and her mother-in-law with the same careful, assessing look she must use on a patient whose full diagnosis has not yet been confirmed.
Then, once the plates were cleared and the tea brought out, I laid the documents on the table. The bank loan paperwork my brother had discreetly obtained, the printed record confirming Aliyu's termination date from his former employer 8 months prior, and the cooperative society envelope name I had finally cross-referenced against the loan filing Ibrahim had traced to the GRA compound. I did not say anything dramatic. I simply slid the papers toward the center of the table and said quietly, "I think it is time we all stopped pretending we don't know what these mean." The room went the particular kind of silence that precedes either an explosion or a collapse. Aliu's face did something I will remember for a long time. Not anger first, but something closer to relief mixed with humiliation. The face of a man who has been carrying a lie so long that having it finally spoken aloud by someone else feels almost like being allowed to put down a heavy bag, even as it burns with shame. He did not deny it. He reached for the papers, looked at them without really reading them, the way a person looks at evidence they already know by heart, and put his head down and said quietly, "I did not know how to tell her I had failed before we even started." Sule, who had been silent until that point, finally spoke, and his voice was not loud, but it carried a weight that made even Hajia sit up straighter. "You stood in my parlor," he said, "and you looked me in the eye, and you told me you are building a life for my daughter. Which life were you building, Aliu? The one you told me about, or the one you were hiding from her every single morning you left that house, pretending to go to an office that no longer wanted you?" Aliu did not have an answer for this, or if he did not trust himself to say it without his voice breaking, because I watched his jaw walk silently for several seconds before he managed to speak again. I kept thinking I would fix it before anyone had to know. Every week I told myself, next week I will have found something. I will have paid down enough of it, and then I would tell her, and it would just be a story we laugh about later. But the debt kept growing, and the shame kept growing faster than the debt. And somewhere in there, I think I stopped being able to tell the difference between protecting my house and protecting my pride. Amina's hand, I noticed, went instinctively to the table's edge, gripping it, But she did not speak yet. She was waiting, the way a good doctor waits before delivering a diagnosis, for the full picture before reacting, though I could see in the tightness around her eyes exactly how much it was costing her to hold that silence. Then I turned to Hajia and I told her as gently as I knew how that I had heard her story, the delivery, the loss, the community's cruelty, her husband's decline, the letter in the tin box she still kept folded soft with age. I watched her face change from confusion to something raw and unguarded I had not seen from her in any of our 3 prior meetings. First, a flicker of alarm, as though she feared I meant to use it as a weapon against her, and then when she understood from my tone that I intended no cruelty by it, something closer to exhaustion. The exhaustion of a woman finally being permitted to stop guarding a door she had been leaning against for 30 years. I did not want this for her, Hajia said, finally, her voice breaking in a way I genuinely did not expect from a woman who had presented herself in every previous encounter as composed to the point of coldness. I did not want her to bury a marriage the way I buried mine, slowly, in a hospital corridor, while everyone whispered. She turned to Aminat directly, and her hands, I noticed, were shaking slightly around her teacup. You remind me of who I was before that night, sharp, certain, proud of your hands. And I kept thinking, if she stays in that hospital, one day something will happen that is not her fault, and this family will pay for it the way my own paid. And I could not watch it happen twice. I told myself I was protecting you. I did not ask myself whether you wanted my protection or whether it was even mine to give. Nasiru, Aliu's younger brother, who had said almost nothing throughout the entire meal, spoke up then for the first time, quietly, almost to himself. Mama, you never told us any of this. All these years, we just thought you didn't like hospitals. Hajia let out a small broken sound that was not quite a laugh and said, what was I supposed to say? That I buried my career and half of my pride in that ward and then buried your father a little at a time. Some things a mother carries alone because she does not know how to hand them to her children without breaking them too. Aliu, hearing his mother's full story laid bare for what may have been the first time in his adult life, looked at her the way a son looks at a parent he is realizing he never fully knew, and something in his posture broke open. You let me believe you simply preferred a certain kind of home, he said slowly, almost accusatorily, though there was no real anger in it, only the ache of a man recalculating everything he thought he understood about his own upbringing. I built my whole idea of what a wife should be around a story I didn't even know the real shape of. Amina finally spoke. She did not shout. If you know my daughter, shouting has never been her instrument. Her weapon has always been precision, the same precision that made her the housemanship colleagues used to nickname the surgeon's daughter, even though neither of her parents had ever touched a scalpel professionally. She looked first at her mother-in-law, and her voice, when it came, was gentler than I expected, though no less firm for its gentleness. Hajia, I am sorry what happened to you. I mean that. What that family did to your name, what it did to your husband, what it cost you, that was cruel and it was not fair. And I understand now, in a way I did not before today, why the sight of me and Scrubs made something in you afraid. But I need you to hear me clearly. Your story is not my story. I am not you walking into a delivery room 30 years ago with less staff and less equipment and a whole community ready to blame a woman the moment something went wrong. I trained in a different time with different protections, and even if something terrible happened to me one day, and it might, because medicine carries that risk, every single doctor knows that risk when we choose this path, it would not mean I am doomed to repeat your ending simply because we both once wore a uniform to save lives. I am not a ghost you are trying to protect. I am a person standing in front of you, and I am asking you to see me.
Then she turned to Aliu, and something in her tone shifted, sharper now, though still controlled. You do not get to hide behind your mother's grief either, she said. You knew, better than anyone, exactly how much this profession cost me to build. You sat across from my father and promised him you would never ask me to put it down. And then the moment your own life became difficult, you decided the easiest thing to break was not your silence about your job, not your pride, but me. You didn't ask me to help carry the debt. You didn't ask me to slow down for a season while we sorted it together. You asked me to disappear. There's a difference between asking a wife to bend and asking her to vanish, Aliyu, and you crossed that line without once discussing it with me as an equal. The table was silent after that, the kind of silence that follows a truth spoken so plainly that no one in the room has an immediate rebuttal for it, only the discomfort of sitting inside its accuracy. I will not tell you that everything resolved cleanly in that room, because it did not, and I distrust any story that claims a single Sunday afternoon conversation fixes 30 years of buried grief and 8 months of accumulated deception. What happened instead was slower, and I think more honest than a clean resolution would have been. Aliyu sat with his hands over his face for a long moment after Amina finished speaking, and when he finally looked up, he did not offer excuses or arguments, only a plain admission that seemed to cost him something physical to say. "You are right," he told her. "I asked you to vanish because it was easier than admitting I had failed. I don't have a defense for that. I only have an apology, and I know an apology doesn't undo 8 months." Amina did not immediately forgive him in that room, and I respected her for that, because forgiveness handed over too quickly before the person asking for it has actually changed anything is not really forgiveness, it is only relief, and relief does not repair a marriage on its own. What Aliyu did agree to that day, concretely, without hedging, was this: that Amina would return fully to her hospital duties, night calls included, without further resistance from him, effective that same week. He agreed to remove himself as joint signatory on her account, restoring it to her sole control, personally accompanying her to the bank branch the following Tuesday to sign the paperwork himself so there would be no ambiguity about his intentions. And, with visible difficulty, sitting there at our dining table in front of his mother, his brother, and his in-laws, he finally laid out the true state of his debts in full, the exact figure owed to the cooperative society, the collapsed vehicle parts venture, the risk it posed to the compound itself, so that the crisis could finally be faced together, honestly as partners, rather than managed alone in secret by a man too ashamed to share the weight of it. That part at least was a genuine repair, the beginning of one anyway. They worked over the following months on a real repayment plan for the cooperative loan, sitting down most Sunday evenings with a notebook and Amina's calculator app, tracking what had been paid and what remained, a small ritual that Amina later told me became one of the things that rebuilt her trust in him faster than any apology could have. The simple, repeated evidence of a man showing up honestly to a hard task rather than hiding from it. Aliyu, humbled considerably by the entire ordeal, found new employment within 10 weeks, a smaller position than before, junior to what he had previously held at a haulage firm on the outskirts of town, but an honest one, disclosed openly to his wife from his very first day, and he stopped performing a job he no longer had. Hajia's part of this healing has been slower, and I will be honest with you, it is not complete even now. Aliyu did apologize directly to Amina once in the kitchen, about 3 weeks after that Sunday, a short, stiff apology that cost her visibly a great deal to say. Amina described it to me afterwards as Hajia standing very straight by the stove, not quite meeting her eyes, saying only, "I was wrong to try to shape you into a story that was never yours. I hope in time you will let me be a better mother to you than I was in those first months." It was not an elaborate apology. It did not include the word sorry as plainly as I might have wished for on my daughter's behalf, but Amina accepted it with more grace than I think I would have managed at her age, telling me later that she had chosen to weigh the apology by its honesty rather than its polish, and it had at least been honest. But old fear does not dissolve in a single apology, and I think it is important that I tell you this part truthfully rather than tying a nice bow over it for the sake of a satisfying ending. Hajia still goes quiet at the dinner table when the subject of Amina's shift schedule comes up. She still, even now, sometimes glances at that portrait on the wall when Amina leaves for a night call. A small, unconscious gesture Amina says she has learned to recognize and simply let pass without comment. There was an evening, maybe 8 months after the confrontation, when Amina mentioned offhandedly that she had been assigned a difficult breach case earlier that week, and Hajia's hand, Amina told me, had frozen mid-motion over the pot she was stirring, just for a second, before she caught herself and continued as though nothing had happened. Neither of them mentioned it. Some conversations, Amina has come to believe, are better left as private acknowledgements passed silently between two women who understand exactly what just happened without needing to say it aloud. Hajia occasionally still makes a comment about hospital wives that she catches herself saying and stops halfway through, as though some old groove in her mind keeps trying to run after she has consciously decided to stop it, the way an old habit of the tongue outlives the belief that once produced it. Amina does not fight her on these small relapses anymore. She has told me she has decided to let her mother-in-law's healing take whatever time it takes, without staking her own freedom on the outcome of it, a decision I have come to admire the longer I have watched her hold to it. "I am not responsible for finishing her healing," Amina told me once, sitting in my kitchen on one of her rare free Sunday afternoons. "I am only responsible for not disappearing while she works on it." There has been real progress too, and I do not want to leave you with the impression that Hajia remains frozen in her old fear entirely last Ramadan. When Amina was posted for an exceptionally demanding call schedule during the fasting month, it was Hajia, not Aliyu, who took it upon herself to prepare Amina's suhu each morning before her early shifts, waking before dawn to have something warm ready. A small wordless gesture that Amina says moved her more than any spoken apology could have. Nasiri told me separately that his mother had begun telling neighbors, with something that sounded almost like pride creeping back into her voice after all these years, that her daughter-in-law was the doctor at the teaching hospital, a sentence she would not have volunteered easily even 18 months earlier.
It has been almost 2 years now since that Sunday. Amina finished her housemanship, went on to begin her residency in obstetrics and gynecology, a choice she made deliberately, she told me once, almost as if she were quietly answering a story she had never asked to inherit, choosing of all the specialties open to her, the exact field in which her mother-in-law's oldest wound had been carved, not out of defiance, she insisted, but out of something closer to a calling she could not fully explain, even to herself. "Maybe I want to be in the room when it goes wrong," she told me once, late at night on the phone, so that fewer families end up carrying what Hajia carried. The loan to the cooperative society was fully repaid last year, a milestone the whole family marked with a modest dinner at our house, Hajia included, where Sule offered a short prayer of gratitude that had both Amina and Aliyu wiping their eyes before the food was even served. Aliyu has since moved into a slightly better position at the haulage farm, promoted this past January on the strength of steady, unremarkable competence rather than any dramatic turnaround, which is, I think, exactly the kind of quiet redemption a man like him needed. Not a grand comeback, just the slow accumulation of ordinary trustworthiness, day after day, until trust simply became the normal state of the household again, rather than something anyone had to keep actively rebuilding. They are not the couple who exists only in wedding photographs anymore, radiant and untested. They are something more ordinary and more real. Two people who nearly lost each other to an inherited fear neither of them created, who chose, once it was finally named, to build something more honest out of the wreckage. It is not perfect. Aliyu still sometimes tenses when Amina mentions a late shift, an old reflex his body has not entirely unlearned, even though his mind now knows better. A flicker across his face he cannot always suppress in time, though he has learned to name it out loud now, instead of acting on it. "Sorry.
old habit, he will say, almost sheepishly, and Amina has learned to simply nod and let the moment pass rather than treating it as a relapse into who he used to be. She still sometimes catches him watching her get ready for work with an expression she cannot fully read, something between pride and old fear standing side by side. And she has come to understand that this too may simply be part of what he carries now, a permanent low hum beneath an otherwise repaired marriage, the way a bone once broken sometimes aches faintly before rain, even after it has fully healed. Amina told me on her most recent visit home that she and Aliyu had begun trying for their first child, a decision she said she would not have felt safe making 18 months earlier, when she was not yet certain the man she would be raising that child with had fully unlearned the instinct to ask her to fold herself smaller whenever life became difficult. I needed to know he could survive hard things without asking me to disappear first, she said, stirring sugar into her tea in my kitchen, her wedding ring catching the afternoon light. I now think he can. I don't think I would have said that a year ago. That sentence, more than anything Aliyu himself has said to me since that Sunday, is what finally let me exhale fully as her mother. I think often still about how differently this could have ended. If I had not visited that weekend and noticed the photograph, if Ibrahim had not had the particular contacts he had, or had been too busy to help me, if Amina had been a quieter woman, the kind who absorbs pressure silently rather than mentioning it to her mother in small offhand comments over the phone, the trouble might have grown roots too deep to pull out before anyone outside that compound noticed. I do not say this to claim credit for saving my daughter's marriage, because in the end, it was Amina's own clarity at that table, her refusal to let compassion for Hajia's history collapse into an excuse for Aliyu's behavior, that did the real work. I only opened the door. She was the one brave enough to walk everyone else through it and demand that they meet her honestly on the other side. But he no longer asks her to disappear. That, in the end, is what changed. And for a marriage that came within one lie of collapsing, I have learned to call that its own kind of victory. If there's one thing I have carried away from watching my daughter survive this, it is that the fights inside a marriage are rarely only about the two people standing in the room. Somewhere behind almost every tradition a spouse insists cannot be broken, there's an old wound nobody has properly grieved, quietly deciding on behalf of people who never agreed to inherit it, what they are and are not allowed to become. I think of Hajia sometimes, 30 years younger, walking home in her nurse's uniform past neighbors who doubted her, proud in a way she would not be allowed to stay proud for long. And I understand now that the woman who tried to take that same pride away from my daughter was not simply cruel. She was frightened, in the specific bone-deep way that only someone who has already lost something precious once can be frightened. And fear like that, left unexamined long enough, will eventually reach for whoever is nearest and try to keep them small enough to feel safe. My daughter did not simply fight for the right to wear her white coat. She fought to stop being asked to bury herself inside someone else's unresolved grief, and she won that fight without losing her marriage entirely, which I have come to believe is a rarer and harder thing than winning it by walking away. Walking away is, in its own way, the simpler ending, cleaner, easier to explain to relatives, easier to justify at the mosque. But what Amina did instead was harder to explain, and I think more honest to what real love actually requires. She stayed long enough to name the wound precisely, refused to let it consume her, and then waited, without abandoning either herself or him, to see whether the man she had married could actually become someone capable of loving her without needing her smaller. He did become that man, imperfectly, slowly, with visible effort rather than natural grace. And I think that imperfection is exactly what makes their marriage now feel more solid than it was on their wedding day, when everything between them was still untested and easy to admire from the outside. If this story moved something in you, if it reminded you of a wound in your own family that has been quietly making decisions for a generation that never agreed to inherit it, a mother's silence, a father's old failure, a grandmother's unspoken shame that somehow became a rule nobody remembers agreeing to, stay close to this channel because there are more stories like this one waiting. And I promise you, every single one of them is worth the time it takes to understand where the fear really began. Subscribe if you want to be here for the next one, because trust me, the families I have sat across from since Amina's story are proof that hers was not even the most complicated one I know.